Welcome to True Crime Wine Wednesday. I am Sherilyn Dale, and I'm so glad you found me. If you're new to the channel, thank you so much for stopping by. Over here, we discuss true crime. Occasionally, we indulge in some bevies, but we always love and support each other, and our main focus is justice for victims. So if that sounds like something you are into, I would be so thankful if you would stick around. I have a new video for you every single Wednesday, but sometimes that shows up on a Friday. All right, let's get started. Get all settled. While you do that, here's this week's riddle. What is full of holes but still holds water? All right, today's case, I actually had it show up in my Kindle suggestion, Kel Surprise, that it was a true crime book that my Kindle thought I should read. But immediately I was drawn into it, and then I was floored to find out that the victim in the story is from where I live in Edmonton, Canada. Alberta. Did that all backwards, but that's okay. And that always hits really close to home, obviously, because it's close to home. Anyways, it does add like this other element to it, and I just felt so much more connected. And I know a lot of you always comment if we're doing a case and it's from where you live, that it just, I don't know, it just feels some type of way. So I know that if that's happened to you, you know what I'm talking about today. So today we are talking about the death of a woman named Nancy Cooper. She was a wife and mother of two who went missing July 12th, 2008, and she was found 2 days later. The police made an arrest 3 months after her body was discovered, but that's kind of been a focus of some controversy. And despite there even being a guilty plea and charges laid, there are people out there who think that the person was charged as innocent. I will let you decide. Nancy Rentz was born to Gary and Donna Rentz in Edmonton, Alberta. She grew up with her twin sister, Krista, her brother, Jeff, and her younger sister, Jill. Nancy is described as quite sporty. She was into ringette and was quite a skilled player, I read. It sounds like she was just like an all-around really good athlete at anything she did, and she looked very kind of like timid growing up and then grew up into this beautiful swan. She was very interested in jewelry and art and fashion, like very artistic, but still had this very sporty, fun-loving side. And she's described as wildly intelligent. At 26 years old, she got a job in Calgary for IBM. IBM is a tech company, and I always remember seeing their logo. And in 1999, they were I think the company to work for in terms of technology, especially in 99. I don't know if anybody remembers the whole Y2K thing, but we were just on this crazy cusp of computers and technology and internet and all that stuff. And so she had an amazing opportunity there. In addition to also working at IBM, she also ran her own clothing company. Nancy's just very independent, clearly driven, and I think that is something to just always stick through as we are talking about her story today. So it was in Calgary in 1999 while working for IBM. She met a coworker named Brad Cooper, who was also from Alberta, but he was from Medicine Hat. They became pretty tight at work, and Nancy actually thought that he would be a really good fit for a friend of hers, and she was kind of trying to play matchmaker. I guess Brad said it wasn't really something he was into. He was currently going through a little bit of a messy relationship ending, and this was also something that Nancy was going through. She had been involved with some prominent Calgary business guy. And it sounds like he really took advantage of her worth and, I don't know, wasn't really ready to commit to Nancy the way she deserved. So as Nancy and Brad are kind of talking to each other, going through these heartbreaks, they start to bond over the similar situation and having broken hearts and start kind of entertaining the idea of maybe seeing each other as, potential partners. This was a new route for Nancy. She's described as dating, the more popular, very outgoing guys, and Brad was very quiet and introverted. Nancy's twin sister said that it wasn't an instant decision for Nancy to date Brad. It sounded like he was definitely pursuing and putting in the time to open her up to the idea of like trying something new. And she thought it could be a really cute coupling when one day she walked into the apartment that her and Nancy were sharing in Calgary, and Brad was sitting on the couch watching a movie. It was Steel Magnolia, so definitely like a chick flick. And Nancy was asleep on his lap, and she's like, "You're just like gonna sit here and watch this?" And he's like, "Yeah, I don't want to, disturb her. Obviously, she just needs the sleep." And he just sat there and watched the movie. So she thought that that was really really cute of him to do. I think as Nancy opened up to the possibility with Brad, it was a lot to do with the stability that he could give. She wanted to have a family and have children and get married, and the guys that she was seeing just were not giving her that security. And she told her family that the difference between Brad was that he just felt like safety to her, which makes sense. Brad grew up in a very traditional middle-class family in Medicine Hat. He was one of two sons to Terry and Carol Cooper. I always love last names that like go with the first name, like Carol Cooper. Love it. His parents had successful careers. His dad was a college chemistry teacher who went on to be the vice president at the College of Medicine Hat. He also sat on numerous community boards, so he was well known as a staple figure, if you will, in the community. And Carol was known as just like a sweet homemaker who loved to garden. Brad is also described as quite athletic and very intelligent. He had like above average IQ. And he's described as a very goal-driven man, which I think also appealed to Nancy because he had a focus and he had a path. He even started a blog called Adventures with Brad. And in there, he had like his goals and then completed goals. In the completed goals, he put that he had a master's degree, a technical work certificate, and several Ironman competitions. Brad personally had described his childhood as just like uneventful. There's nothing really significant to point out, like good or bad. And when he spoke about his family, it was kind of passive, kind of cold. And I mean, some families are just like that. There's not like a lot of engagement. There's not a lot of emotion. But with coming into Nancy's life, Nancy's family was such a huge contrast. They were very close and all of them had outgoing personalities. So with Brad being much more quiet and introverted, which there's nothing wrong with, the family just felt like initially it was kind of hard to read him. Her sister actually described trying to engage in conversation with him at that time, like pulling out teeth. It was just like when you're just like constantly putting out something and you're like, give me something back, buddy. Kind of like that. But again, this seemed to kind of work with Nancy and Brad because everything that he was kind of not, she was. And plus they did have common interests. And I think that that can be very successful in a relationship if you've got one person that's more extroverted and friendly and fun-loving and bubbly like Nancy was, where Brad is just more a little bit reserved, observant, goal-oriented, and I guess more practical. And then when you have like common interests with your life and family and stuff like that, like sometimes that can balance really well. Sometimes doesn't go so well. But Nancy really seemed to be liking this change from like the typical guy that she would date. And so everybody was supportive. And as the relationship grew, they could see that he was really making an effort to try to open up more. And it got to the point where Brad, even if he was still kind of a little bit standoffish, he considered Nancy's family more of a family to him than he did like his own family. So in 1999, he proposed to Nancy, and the plan was for them to have, the dream wedding that Nancy wanted, something big with a lot of people. But Brad ended up getting a job offer working out for the Cisco phone company. I don't know if anyone remembers this. Is Cisco still around? maybe in the United States. Maybe, I don't think it's around in Canada, but I can just see the logo. Anyways, he got this opportunity to go out to the United States, and that expedited Nancy and his marriage, because if he was going, Nancy and him had to legally be married for her to join him. And so she was okay with that. They decided to get married quickly. She gave up that big wedding plan that she had, and they went out to North Carolina. And I think that it really spoke to Nancy's selflessness. She's always putting people before herself that she cared about. And she was very successful in her own career, but gave that up for Brad's opportunity that he was offered. Like, she was okay being like, it's okay. We can renew the vows and do something fancy another time. And even giving up like the comfort that she had set up for herself, just trusting that they were going to rebuild whatever they put their mind to, no matter where they were. So they had a very small wedding ceremony in a restaurant in Calgary. It was only Nancy's family, one of Brad's brothers, or Brad's only brother, and a few friends and family. And then they moved out to Cary, North Carolina. Now, I read everywhere I read about this case, Cary is described as the spot like where you would imagine where like the American dream would go for a family. Futuristic Pleasantville is what is quoted everywhere that I read it. I think National Geographic was the first to refer to Cary as the futuristic Pleasantville. And then everywhere I went about this case from, then that's what I got. So I'm rolling with that too. This is described as an area where regularly neighbors would just get together and have barbecues, bouncing back between people's houses. The kids would just like roam free. But Nancy really struggled when she arrived. At that point, her and Brad weren't really set up like as a family yet. It was just the two of them. She had given up her career and her family that she was really close with. And she wasn't able to work when they first got there because she needed a visa, and all of that needed to go through Brad, since he was the one that was like bringing her there, and he was the one with the work opportunity. I just really felt for Nancy reading about the whole situation, because I think like sometimes you get in your mind that, maybe there is a really great opportunity for your partner, and you're going to go and you're going to do this, and you could be somebody listening right now that is Nancy to a T, like very independent and strong-willed and determined, and then you're kind of left to rely on somebody else and can't just like go out there and make something for yourself. And when I think about the timeline, like she really, really tried, but it was like 2 years and nothing was really moving for her. She's waiting on a visa, Brad's working, and you're just kind of left dependent on somebody. And even though she's in constant contact with her family to try to feel like a little bit of normalcy, it's over the phone, like they're up in Canada, she's in the United States, like that distance can really be hard. So 2 years after moving to North Carolina, she flew home for Christmas. And when she got home, she was like, I do not want to go back to Cary. Like, I don't think that I can do this. She also spoke to Brad while she was out there just about how unhappy she was, and said the same thing. Like, I don't want to go back. And I guess he was so upset that he also flew to Edmonton and convinced her to go back with him. And this was a decision that her family supported. Like, they had grown attached to Brad. They thought that he was a good fit for Nancy, was going to take good care of her, and that everything was going to sort out and eventually be worth it. They were like, you guys are married, and it's worth trying to make it work if you can see, if you can keep focused on the vision that you already saw. So she went back, and when she went back, things did start to improve. She was starting to get out there a little bit and make an effort to make friends. She got a car for herself, so she had that independence to not just be like sitting at home waiting. And she was able to earn a little bit of money here and there, just like working some cash jobs as a nanny, helping out in the neighborhood. Then things got even better when her first daughter, Bella, was born in February 2004. This was after several miscarriages that she had gone through, so it was really special and important to her. And I think also one of those factors that was weighing on her, like just nothing was seeming to go well, and that she didn't have that proper support system. So when Bella was finally born, it just kind of like brought all new insight and hope to her life. And then 2 years after that, in 2006, another baby girl, Katie, was born. Again, Katie came after several other miscarriages. So I'm sure it really contributed into like how tightly Nancy cherished her children. Again, things seemed to be okay, but it was kind of like this pattern of like 2 years. And so in early 2008, there were definitely fractures showing in Brad and Nancy's marriage. As much as Nancy loved being a mom, not having a path at this point still, career-wise, or having that independence made her feel very frustrated, unhappy, and it was clearly putting a strain on her and Brad's relationship. It sounds like when they discussed, having a family and stuff like that, it was never going to be the intention that Nancy was never going to go back to work, that she was going to be like a stay-at-home mom. And we're in such a different time right now. I truly believe that there are just incredible women out there who are able to have that independence and work their career and still be phenomenal moms. I think that sometimes it can make you an even better mom because you're able to kind of step away, reset, really cherish those moments when you are home with your kids. And so when she kind of lost everything, it leads to resentment towards your spouse a little bit, where you're just like, this was not what I signed up for. Like, yes, I love my kids, but I also love my career. And those two things can work at the same time. And it just wasn't. Her friends in North Carolina said that they considered Nancy to be pretty much a single mom. They never really saw Brad anywhere. Even when he did come home from work or had days off, he was never involved in the activities that Nancy always had planned for the kids. They said that he was usually always at home, and he had like a exercise room with a bike in it that he used to always like train for his Ironman and stuff. And he would just lock himself in there and just tell the girls to leave him train, even if he wasn't training for something. I mean, sometimes, with those things, you're always training. Anyways, this wasn't just like, okay, like leave me while I do like a Peloton class for 45 minutes. This was like, I'm in here for 8 hours. Don't come to the door. When he did go to social events, he made it very hard for people to open up to him or to get a read on him, much like Nancy's family initially described when they first met him. He would just kind of like sit in the corner by himself, didn't really seem to be engaged or look like he wanted to be there. I guess you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. If he didn't go places, people like he was absent. When he did sit there, he was not social. But that is, I guess, like that's just kind of, you've got to be aware of like the impression you're putting out there, because that's what people go off of you by. I just also want to make it clear there are wonderful husbands and parents out there who share similar personality traits, but that can be just very kind and loving behind closed doors in their own way. And marriages like that can work. But in some of the concerns that Nancy was having and her friends were seeing, it was about like an extreme lack of involvement. Like when one of the girls had to be rushed to the hospital for an injury and Nancy called him and he was like, I'm at work. You're home with the kids, deal with it. Like, what am I going to do? Or when Nancy was actually miscarrying one time and he said that he couldn't leave work and she could drive herself to the hospital because she had a car now. The tensions and disconnect were becoming more obvious to everybody when Nancy would go and see her friends. When, you just have the casual like, oh, how's Brad doing? Like Nancy's demeanor would change a little bit, and it was almost like she was needing to like walk on eggshells to describe like how things were going, because she still wanted to be quite supportive for him, but also wanted to not open up too much and like upset him, but get support from her friends. And even their kids were seeing quite a different side of Brad. He would often yell at Nancy in front of them, to the point where her kids would ask, like, why does daddy hate you? Or why does my dad hate my mom? Now this, as things were getting bad, I really want you to focus about how all these changes happen subtly, because it's really, really important to the message of the story at the end that I want to give, where right now we're talking about 6 years worth of time. So that's a lot of time where this is just a very subtle buildup. And it was around this time that this kind of like anger side of Brad was showing, and Nancy was more walking on eggshells and not wanting to ask like, hey, how are things going with the visa? Like, it's been a minute. I'd like to get to work, and not wanting to set him off. And so around this time, he then started accusing Nancy of being a bad budgeter, like very bad with money, and he cut her off of all of their bank accounts, their credit cards, and he would just give her a weekly allowance. Which some people, hey, that works in the marriage. They need that. But somebody like Nancy, who is used to being so independent, so hardworking, I can't imagine how demoralizing that would feel, especially when she's just like desperately wanting paperwork to be filed so that she can get a job, and it's just not happening. So when that happened, she would tell her family, like, I really don't know what to do. He's in control of the money, but the money that he's giving, it's not even enough for me to get groceries for the week for the girls and I. And so she started taking side jobs with her friends, like to paint their houses and stuff like that. She was also secretly selling off some of her clothes because she just didn't have enough money from the allowance. She put on a brave face, though, made it work. A lot of people didn't know that things had gotten that bad. She had reached out to her family for some assistance, and they had been sending money to try and support Nancy like as best they could. But the final straw came when Nancy had suspicions about multiple affairs, and Brad had eventually come clean after like over a year of denying. So Brad traveled a lot for work. He'd be gone for weeks at a time. Just got to make it clear one more time, this is some marriages, and that's okay. It doesn't always mean something shifty's going on. But it was the lack of communication and like connect with her that was really concerning. There was basically zero phone calls to check in and call the girls. She said, if anything, she might hear from him like once on email. And I just based on like the marriage that I have, I can't compare the two. But if I only spoke to my husband once a week when he was away via email, I would struggle for sure. So she felt like something was up and started looking into the places that he was saying he was going for, like conferences. He had gone to a couple boat shows during the year. And when she actually started looking them up and like backdating, most of them didn't exist. So she's like, well, where the hell is he going? But there was no proof. It was just accusations, and then she was constantly shut down and being told that she was just crazy and didn't trust him. And then there was a revelation about an affair between Brad and actually a woman that Nancy considered a really close friend out in North Carolina. This woman actually threw her baby shower. The nerve. This is some freaking Vanderpump stuff right now, you guys. If you've been following my stories on Instagram, I apologize. Listen, next week, the reunion is the final part, so you guys will have a little bit of a break. But this is some Raquel and Ariana stuff going on. And yeah, Nancy found out that Brad and this friend of hers had like fornicated in their house, in one of their closets, might I add, while he was there watching the girls, and the girls had been in bed. I'm telling you, Vanderpump, right? So this one was like the real obvious trigger for Nancy, and he had denied it over a year, just gaslighting her. She would bring forward facts, and he would literally be able to talk his way out of it and then spin it that she was crazy, where then she would feel so horrible for accusing him. And then when they went to a marriage counselor to try to get past all of this, try to get past through Nancy's insecurities and suspicions, it actually came out at the counselors that this affair had gone on. It had been going on for a bit, and that he even had mentioned that he thought that he loved her at one point, but wanted to make it work with Nancy. So she was like, the damage has been done. Like, I have felt out of my mind for the past year. I don't know if I can move forward. Nancy really wanted to get out of the United States. Understandably, what would she do if her and Brad's marriage was deteriorating, which she wasn't even able to work up until this point? So she wanted to move back to Canada. The plan was for her to move back to Ontario move to Ontario rather, to stay with her twin sister for a little bit. Her twin sister had a hysterectomy and was unable to have kids. So she was always calling in, not just to check in on Nancy, but to check on her nieces as well. And her nieces actually called her Mum Krista, which I thought is like so cute. So initially Brad was like, okay, that's like a decent proposal. We can make it work. We'll split the costs of the travel between the girls visiting me on like the weekends or every other weekend, and then they can stay with you. But then he started like backpedaling and throwing out weird suggestions about custody. He was like, how about you leave and then they come visit me for the summer, and when the summer's over, I never want to see them again. Like, I'll just be out of their life for good. And Nancy was like, that is definitely not a healthy situation and quite damaging to the children. No. And then he started suggesting some parent trap type scenario where they would just split the girls up and one would stay with him in North Carolina and one would stay with her in Ontario. Again, super damaging, I think, to children to be like split like that. So Nancy just was like, no, I think we need to just figure out a better solution. So during this period, Nancy's also kind of struggling with wondering why Brad is all of a sudden like so involved like in terms of the kids, because it had never seemed to be an interest. And she thought that this would actually be something that he would totally be on board with because he worked so much, because he was so absent from home, and then they could just like coordinate the schedule and the girls could go there when he was available. So while they're starting to sort that out, Nancy goes on a trip to meet up with her family in High Rock Lake, and Brad didn't go to this get-together. And it's when Nancy was face to face with her family that she was able to kind of just like fully let everything go and admit like the struggles that had been going on and how heavy it was weighing on her, and that she really felt just like helpless in the whole situation. Everyone was kind of hearing that the plan was for the girls and Nancy to come back, and then she was able to tell them like, no, he's backpedaling now. And Nancy had actually been a little bit worrisome, like proactive about like the suspicions that Brad was going to do this. And she hid the girls' passports in her car because she didn't want him to like take them and hide them from her. So she had them in there and then found out that Brad had gotten into her car and stole the girls' passports. So even if she had wanted to leave and go back with her family after this trip, she was like, I'm not going to leave the girls. Like, and he knows that. He knows that as long as he has those passports, I'm not leaving them. So her family straight up just says to Nancy, like, are you scared for yours or your girl's safety? And Nancy's like, no, not at all. I don't think that Brad would ever hurt me, but like, this is just becoming too much. And they just, even though something didn't feel right, just based on Nancy's personality, she was very bold, very brave woman. They were like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Let's figure this out. I think that the first step that we need to do right now is you go back home and we send out a retainer for you to get a divorce lawyer, and we get the separation going right now because it's not working between the two of you trying to figure out the arrangements. So that was the plan. They left, and Nancy's family got home and sent her a retainer and got her a divorce lawyer. When she got home, she was horrified. She walks into the home and it's just filthy. Like, the whole time that she had been gone, everything that Brad ate, did, nothing was clean. Dishes were piled high. She had phoned her father and said that there was like some form of like worm infestation in the kitchen. There were ants absolutely everywhere. They'd even made their way to the kids' playroom, all over their toys. And she was just like, is this like punishment for me just going and visiting my family like she did multiple times a year? It was so bad that she actually had to call a exterminator to come and take care of the bugs. And from here, just a whole roller coaster of emotions. Brad was like, okay, yeah, I agree. We need to have this done. We need to sell the house. So Nancy was like, all right, I'm going to start painting, getting the house ready for a nice quick sale. Like, let's just close this up right now. And then he'd come home and be like, you actually need to be out of here like by the end of the week. And she's like, well, where am I going to go? And I don't have the kids' passports. And then he'd come home and be like, you actually have to be out by the end of the day. It doesn't work like that, Brad, first of all. And during a lot of these arguments, everything was kind of resorting back to him not paying Nancy. It was always like, and I don't know what you think you're going to get out of me. I'm not paying with you. You're going back to Canada and you're going to live with your sister anyways, so your family can support you. I'm not supporting you if you have somewhere to live. Again, Brad doesn't work like that. Just because someone has a roof over their head doesn't mean like every bill and like basic human need just ceased to exist. Anyways, so Nancy was just trying to be patient, let everything work out through the courts, keep any form of normalcy that she could with the girls as like the days were just like quickly wrapping up and she was going to be getting out of there. So when she and Brad were both invited to their neighbor's house on July 11th, 2008 to have one of those like evening barbecue get-togethers with the girls, she was like, you know what, I think this would be good. Let's get out of the house. Brad can come and we'll just, show up and put on a happy face. Nancy's friends said that they did notice in the last like couple weeks of like when everything was going through the courts that Brad was making more of an appearance to some of these things and seeming more involved with the girls. Like he would go, he'd be off with the side with the girls where he never would be. And Nancy would be like, oh yeah, like just father of the year all of a sudden, and felt like it was really obvious that he had spoken to a lawyer, was talking about child support just based on him saying like, I'm not going to give you any money for the girls because you're going to live with your parents, and that she had the feeling that he was going to go for sole custody so that he didn't have to pay. So, he needs to change a little bit and be more involved and for people to see. Her friends said that Nancy had even come across like a sheet of paper that had the girls' names on it, and Brad had wrote out what their likes were and like what they were interested in so that he had it. And then on the other side of it was life insurance information, like just lots of weird stuff going on at this time. Brad had ended up leaving the party earlier that evening. He left around 8 with the girls, and Nancy stayed and hung out with her friends. She hung out till about midnight and then she left, and that was the last time her friends saw her live. It was one of her best friends in the neighborhood that actually became concerned when on the afternoon of July 12th, she couldn't get a hold of Nancy. She and Nancy had plans that morning to get together. They were going to get together at 8 o'clock at her house, and Nancy was going to help her paint her house, which I mentioned she had been doing to try to get extra money. So when Nancy hadn't shown up, she'd given a little bit of time just thinking like maybe she had lost track of time, even though it wasn't really like her. And she called Brad to see if she was at the house. And Brad said no, she went for a run with a newer friend of Nancy's. Her name was Carrie, and they hadn't come back yet. And something about it just didn't seem right. Nancy was the type of person that was always reliable, somebody that you could count on. And she was like friends with everybody. So every time she, talked to one of her friends, she'd mention what she was doing with the other, invite the other. And her friend said like she had never mentioned going on this run with Carrie. She had been training for a marathon with the friend, but she knew like, okay, I've got to be here at 8 a.m. Something else that didn't sit right with her friend was that when she said, I can't get a hold of her, Brad said, oh yeah, she's on a run. She left her keys and her phone here. And the phone specifically was very unsettling. She said she always had her phone with her, and she always did even have her keys with her. She slept with her keys actually because she was scared of Brad taking away her only form of transportation. So it just wasn't sitting right. She decided to call 911.
According to her husband, when I called this morning at about 9, that he said that she had left this morning for a run early, he believed, with her friend Carrie.
Has he been violent with her in the past?
I don't know that he's been physically violent, but I know there's been a lot of tension. And so I wouldn't be surprised. I hate to say it, but I'm not sure what to do.
Is it possible that she might have done something else and possibly forgotten?
She would have made contact with either me or her other friends by now, who both had expected her today. And the fact that her car is still at home and her cell phone is there is a little weird. That would not make sense.
On the 911 call, she's trying not to be too concerned, and I can only imagine what that felt like because she had called Brad and was on a different level than him and didn't know which, where she was outstepping a boundary or if this was even a concern, and didn't want to embarrass Nancy if like she was just having coffee or something like that and just like wanting to delay getting back home and forgot about this. So she's like, we have plans, but she's so reliable that this is why I'm just like following my gut. Her and her husband are going through a divorce. Something is just not feeling right, and I want somebody to go and check for her. She also reaches out to Nancy's twin sister, and she calls Nancy and her parents. They were actually at a funeral in Edmonton when the phone was constantly ringing. Their dad excused himself. He answered the phone, and her twin was like, Nancy's missing. Her friend is extremely concerned. And to everybody, this just wasn't in Nancy's character to just not call and not show up. I'm not a twin, so I can't speak on this, but I have seen like a lot of twins discuss this. But Krista said on the phone with her parents that she felt she was gone. Like there was, you have this bond, this connection, and she said, I couldn't feel her anymore. Even Nancy's dad hung up and looked at his wife and was like, I don't think that this has a happy ending. So I can't imagine what that intuition would have felt like in those moments, like for her family and her friends. Like it just seems like some people just have that like charisma and that energy about them where you are able to just connect with absolutely everybody and make them feel like the only person in the room and your best friend. And I can imagine what that would be like when that light is literally possibly extinguished and that's what you feel, just so heavy. So Krista decides to call Brad and see what's going on. And he is basically just giving the exact same answers that he was giving Nancy's friend. She went for a run. She left at 7 a.m. She hasn't come back. So her sister just keeps prying. And she's very, very bold like Nancy. She's like, you need to give me more than went for a run. Do you know where she went for a run? Do you know what she was wearing? This is very unusual of her to go somewhere without her phone or to check in with her friend that she had plans with. Like, are you not seeing why everybody's concerned here? As she's pushing, eventually Brad just hangs up on her. Now, he was communicating and cooperating with the police, though. He also participated in a search that was organized by Nancy's friends within the community. And there were a lot of people looking for Nancy. A helicopter from the National Guard was assisting. All of her friends had rallied. They went through every trail that they knew that Nancy would go on when she jogged. And I think it's important to note, too, that she was very particular about the trail. She always had her safety in mind, always carried her cell phone, and she chose areas that were pretty busy and that she was very familiar with so that if she, needed to make like a quick action plan, she could. So that's where everybody really focused on. Brad allowed the police to search the home, search their vehicles without an arrest warrant, but there was no sign of Nancy anywhere. Nancy's family also flew in from Canada. Come on, Sherilyn. To assist in finding Nancy. And this is where they kind of were able to speak to their friends from the neighborhood and learn a little bit more about that night. They learned that Brad did show up, which they also kind of were surprised about because he was never really that involved in those types of events, and that he left around 8 p.m. And one of their friends recalled Nancy and him having a little bit, or not a little bit, Nancy was kind of vocal about her feelings about it, but an argument where she was really unhappy because Brad had found out that she was going to be at her friend's house the next morning to paint it and was going to get a little bit of extra money. And he said, oh, well, then I'm not giving you any allowance this week because you've got your own money. You don't need any money from me. And she was like, I hate you, which is understandable because the whole point of why she was doing these side jobs and selling things was because the amount that she was getting was just not enough to sustain the house, her, and the girls. I can only imagine how painful it is to have a child go missing, to be doing everything that you can to try to find them. And it only took 2 days for her family to realize that their intuition and that pain that they were feeling was accurate. 2 days after Nancy went missing, a man was walking his dog and he saw like vultures that were flying around this subdivision that hadn't yet been developed. This was about 5 kilometers away from Brad and Nancy's home. And as he walked closer, he noticed a body that was floating in kind of like in a little like storm water area. It looked almost like a river, but it was just like from storm water. And it turned out to be Nancy. When Nancy had been found, she had been strangled, and she was found in only her sports bra. It was tangled, and she had just one of her diamond earrings in. The other one was missing, and she was wearing nothing else. But there was no sign of a sexual assault. After she was found, so many people in the community started to look at Brad. You know, he's the obvious suspect. He's the husband. But the vibe from the police was not really the same. It was very respectful towards Brad. In press conferences, they were constantly clarifying that he was cooperative, they had searched the house, and that he wasn't a person of interest. And it definitely did seem like he was cooperating with law enforcement, but questionable when it came to things like attending press conferences with Nancy's family or even talking to them in general. They wanted to speak to him in private, and it was not well received. He just was stone-faced, wouldn't look them in the eyes, didn't want to speak to them. And it was really alarming because even though he was a more withdrawn man, he had gotten closer to them and even explained that they were like his own family, closer actually than his own family. And even Nancy's younger sister considered him a really close friend. So his coldness really hurt them on top of losing Nancy. Where is this coming from? Why, almost why are we being punished? What did we do? So his lawyers ended up needing to do their own press conference and just say that, the wild speculation that is going on within the community and the media needed to be addressed. Brad was just a very private guy. He's not used to media attention. And just to be aware that people grieve in different ways and that Brad was wishing to mourn privately. And that's fair. I do agree with that everybody has a different way of grieving. And if you are somebody who's very introverted and shy and just seeing yourself all over the news and your wife and all of a sudden your whole world is kind of broadcast and opened up to assumptions and questions, could probably be pretty heavy. The way he was acting, though, around them and just completely shutting them out and just making them feel like they did something wrong didn't sit right. They were going back to that gut intuition, and they started to fear for the safety of Brad and Nancy's girls, even just with the heaviness of everything going on. If Brad was this fragile and he had changed this much and he was so cold, what were the girls dealing with? So they filed for an emergency custody order. They actually filed for this through Nancy's divorce lawyer, and they learned a lot more about what Nancy was dealing with behind the scenes, and they felt really guilty because they were almost okay, this was a puzzle where we had all of the pieces in front of us, but it was very scrambled, and we just didn't want to put it together and see what was really happening in front of us. They learned that Brad never even applied for the visa, so intentionally making her unable to work and dependent on him. They learned that Nancy said that Brad would only fill up the tank of gas to the amount of gasoline that he thought that she needed. And in her mind, it was okay, is it so that I can't get further away? This is the only amount of gas that you're going to get. And it's the circumference of the area to get to the grocery store, to get to our house and back. And then he would be the one when she needed more to top it up a little bit. She also suspected that he was hacking her emails, monitoring her phone calls with her friends and family. If they had an argument, he would try to take her cell phone away from her. This is when they also learned that that's why she was always sleeping with her keys and her phone, because she was scared that he would just take one of them, take both of them, and she would be fully unable to communicate with anybody. heartbreaking to think about. This is your daughter that you're learning all of these things about, where she was kind of giving those little tidbits, but holding on to a lot of it probably to protect them and not want them to hurt. And with her being somebody who was very independent and just like sure of her capabilities of like taking care of herself, and just the main focus, getting him to agree with the terms of the girls and getting out of there, when she told them, when the last time she saw them, like, I don't think that he's gonna hurt me, or not even don't think, she was like, no, I like, Brad would never hurt me or the kids. I just don't know what he's doing. Like, I don't know how much longer I can hold on for. It's just really upsetting to know that it was only 6 days after she had gotten back from that trip that she was dead. Her parents were awarded temporary custody. They had a lot of support from Nancy's friends in the community that were actually able to see everything day in and day out and hear from Nancy. And even their husbands had, rallied around too, and also gave some of their opinions. I think one of the main concerns was about when Nancy had gotten back from the trip and the house was like just in poor living conditions. That, with also Nancy telling her divorce lawyer and making a statement to help strengthen her divorce case that there was no food and no allowance for her to get more, so that's why she was taking extra jobs, they were awarded temporary custody. So this court battle actually ended up playing a really huge part in finding out what happened to Nancy. Just like Nancy's family and her friends, Brad also had to submit an affidavit just to explain all of their concerns and what his side was. So in his affidavit, he talked more about the morning that Nancy disappeared. And he said that morning around 6:15 a.m., he went to the grocery store. It had been a very long night for him. And he said that later on in the night, Nancy had woken up also because their one daughter woke up and she didn't have any of her milk in the fridge. The groceries were, not topped up. And she couldn't settle. She didn't go back. So they were just kind of like going back and forth trying to comfort her. And by 6:15, she still wasn't awake or asleep. So Brad said, I'll go to the grocery store to get this for her so that we can finally get her to bed. He said he pretty much had pulled up at home after grabbing the milk, and he realized that he had forgotten laundry detergent. So he went back. As he went back, Nancy called him and asked if he could also pick up juice for their other daughter since it was her favorite. And, let's just kind of avoid this catastrophe. He said that call was placed around 6:40. So 6:15 he left. He had drove almost back home, got that call around 6:40 when he was arriving at the grocery store. He said he went straight home. He got home around 7, and pretty much when he arrived, Nancy said that she was going to go out for the run with Carrie, and that was the last time he saw her. Brad explained his lack of concern that everybody was thinking he had based on it not being unusual that after a jog, Nancy usually did visit with friends and they'd go and they'd have coffee together. He said that it wasn't around until noon where he got concerned, and that was after Nancy's 2 friends had called him to see if she had returned yet. He said that he did everything that he could. He packed up the kids. He drove around to the areas that he thought Nancy might be at. He even went to the gym that they had a membership at looking for her, but he couldn't find her. And then he said that the reason why he never called the police was because he already knew Nancy's friend had called the police, and he thought that you needed to wait 24 hours. I just want to make it clear, as far as I know now, I do think that there was a point where that was real. Like, you had to wait a certain amount of time to call. I don't think that exists anymore. At least in Canada, I don't think that exists anymore. I hope that is like everywhere, because we're just seeing now, even if it's like a minor concern and somebody actually isn't missing, like, wouldn't you just rather be on it and proactive and find them? Right? That's the goal, to find them. So police and Nancy's friends did actually contact her friend Carrie, the friend that Brad said Nancy was on a run with, and she filed an affidavit that said that they never had plans to go for a run that morning and that they never did. They did have plans to run the next day, but they weren't doing it that day because she knew that Nancy was going to paint their friend's house. So investigators were able to kind of take all of these affidavits together and add them to the list of things that they were actually having concerns about but were being tight-lipped about. One of the things that they were concerned about was that Brad had light scratches on his neck the day that they came to the house to see if they could find Nancy. And then talking with friends and family and just hearing a little bit about what Nancy's roles were and where she was feeling unsupported in the home, especially when it came to like upkeeping the home, anything to do with the kids or like family life. And Brad was just kind of living separately. And then hearing about the condition of the house when Nancy returned with the kids, they were very suspicious that he had brought up like an annoying amount of times that he had done a deep clean of the house to try to make Nancy happy. He even mentioned cleaning the trunk of his car, and when they looked at his vehicle, the trunk was really clean, but then the rest of the car was just a mess. And then his story started changing around this time. At first, he had said that he saw Nancy leave the house. Then it changed to he heard her just call out when he got home and he was going to tend to the girls that she was leaving. And then it turned to, well, he never really heard or saw anything, but he just assumed when she wasn't downstairs that she went for a run. It's all interesting right now because you got to try to follow along with me, guys. I know there's a lot going on. But as this investigation is happening, this custody battle is also happening because Nancy's family had only been granted, just like a temporary custody of the children, and they wanted full custody. So what happened was, during the custody battle, they were all ordered to go under like a deposition where they're actually videotaped and they're talking about everything. It's like essentially like whatever you say can and will be held against you like in other situations. So it's very risky because it opens up asking Brad questions about how his marriage was, about Nancy's disappearance. And Brad just tried to explain the problems that they had as typical problems in a marriage. He admitted that he did cut her off from the bank accounts and the credit cards, but said that she was an overspender. It was something that he needed to do and that he gave her an allowance.
Do you think that Nancy mistreated you during the marriage?
I'm define mistreatment. I did.
Well, did she treat you poorly during the marriage?
I'd say there was some actions and some conversations that were probably uncalled for. I'm not too sure I'd classify it as mistreatment.
Did you have a good marriage?
I'd say we had our ups and downs.
From January 1, 2008 to July 12, 2008, did you and Nancy have a good marriage?
I would say our marriage was more in the down side of things.
He also admitted to the affair that he had had with Nancy's friend, but said he didn't really understand how Nancy couldn't get past it since the woman who he had the affair with, her ex-husband had already forgiven him. It's like, it's his ex-husband, sweetheart. Her ex-husband, sweetheart. He also denied like any mistreatment to Nancy. He said that the only thing that could kind of be taken out of context is just how he controlled the finances. But other than that, like Nancy was free to like go and do what she wanted. And that he specifically said that he had had other girlfriends in the past and even named them and said that there were never any issues there. It turns out there actually was a really big issue with one of the girlfriends. And when he actually gave her name during his deposition, he gave the wrong last name. Her last name is actually Windsor, but on the deposition, he said that it was Wilson. Investigators kind of felt like, okay, was that like him maybe hoping nobody would be able to track her? The good thing, though, is that she reached out to the investigators because mutual friends had seen this all playing out online and saw like the deposition where he said this and messed up the last name, and she knows that they did not have an okay relationship. She spoke about being very scared of Brad during their relationship. She said that he was controlling. She described him as emotionally abusive and mentally cruel to her. Her actual words and statement were she never had and never ever did again end up in a relationship where she was treated so poorly by someone other than Brad Cooper. And then after the relationship ended, she had never been so scared for her safety. Now, not everybody in town believed that Brad was guilty and that he was getting a lot of negative attention for nothing. One woman wanted to help him. She actually contacted Brad's attorneys, and she claimed that she saw Nancy running around 7 a.m. on the morning that Brad said she had gone for a run. She said that she looked like she was wearing dark running shorts, a white top, and she said hi to her. And that could be a very big deal for Brad, because if that's the case, then his story is right and somebody possibly could have harmed her when she went for this run. The way I read how this testimony was perceived, though, was that she wasn't overly reliable. This was a neighborhood with a lot of runners. It's a very busy. People are walking past, they're running past, there's dogs, there's families. You're just kind of like zooming, by somebody in a second. So it's hard to just like 100% say for sure that this was the person. And she was also described as almost like fangirly when she was testifying. She had brought Nancy Grace up in her statement, saying something along the lines of like, oh, I hope Nancy Grace doesn't show up at my door now. So she really didn't do any good for Brad. Ultimately, Nancy's family was awarded custody of the children. And then, not long after that, on October 27th, 2008, Brad was indicted on first-degree murder charges. That deposition ended up being a huge help. One of the things that was, I guess, most telling was that under oath, he had sworn that the spot that Nancy was found in, he had never been to it, never even knew it had existed, and hadn't seen it for the first time until it was on the news, which directly contradicted with evidence that the FBI had from that search that he allowed at his house, where investigators had confiscated phones and laptops and computers.
Where was Nancy's body found?
From what I understand, it was in a new subdivision, I guess east of the home.
Do you know what street it was on?
I believe the report said it was off Fielding Drive.
Do you know where that is?
I've seen it on a map, yes.
Have you ever driven there?
No.
Do you know if it was near anywhere that Nancy ran, any of her typical running routes?
As far as I know, I cannot imagine Nancy running across that road. It wouldn't be one of the roads I would think that she would run on.
Do you know where it would be in relation to this map?
I guess it'd be over here someplace, I guess. It'd be off the map.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and admit. So is it your testimony, if you can just mark the direction in which it would be, her body would be,
Okay.
but if it's not on the map?
I guess Fielding Drive is over there someplace.
How do you know that, if you just mark it?
Because I saw a map on one of the news articles.
Okay. After you saw, was that a news article that came out after the autopsy or before?
Before the autopsy, I guess.
Okay. And did you have any interest in seeing where the location was?
No, I haven't driven past it. I have no interest in driving past it.
Okay.
So on one of Brad's laptops, there was a Google Map search. This was taken the day before Nancy disappeared, and it is the exact location of that subdivision where Nancy was found, and there's like a point where it's like zoomed in on where Nancy was. And this was the day before, so it's not like this was after, and he was just wanting to get a look at the area to see like where his wife had been found. She was not missing or unalived at that point. This was the day before she disappeared. I also think it's really important to just know that this area is not something like you're looking up somebody's address and you're like zooming in to see if like the Google car caught something really funny on that road. This was just like an unknown, undeveloped subdivision, completely random. So like did not look good. His trial ended up taking place 2 years later, and the prosecution's case was basically that the night that Brad came home early with the kids, he was just stewing that whole night, mad at Nancy. They had multiple witnesses who were able to come forward, just saying that there was like a lot of tension at that time. And then one of their friends who had heard Nancy say that she hated him for taking away her allowance since she was going to be making money the next day with her friend. Not only just that incident, because there had been tension there anyways, but it was a very convenient time in that week leading up to her death where they were talking to lawyers and learning both sides kind of about what the expectation was going to be. And Brad finding out that if Nancy had the girls, he would have to continue sending her money for child support, which probably would have been a lot more than he was giving her for allowance, and just like that stewing in his head, finding ways of not wanting to do it and get out of it, being sole provider of the girls, etc., etc. When him and Nancy had an argument, it was almost like that was the opportunity that he just didn't want Nancy there. Their theory was that either he caught Nancy off guard and choked her from behind, or he actually waited until she was asleep to choke her. He then brought her body to the area that he had already pre-searched out. They then believe that he brought Nancy to his trunk since it was cleaned, went to the grocery store, went to the spot that he had already chosen, and then went back to the grocery store for that second trip. There was a window of about 16 minutes that he had, and prosecutors believe that was more than enough time to dispose of Nancy's body, especially since he already knew where he was going, and that location was actually closer to the grocery store that he had chosen, even though there was a different grocery store that he could have gone to that was actually closer to their home. Now, he was picked up on surveillance both times. In the first video, he's wearing runners. In the other one, 16 minutes later, he comes and he's wearing sandals. But he admitted that he had never gone back home to change, so they must have been on him. And the theory behind that is the area that Nancy was found was very muddy. It's like an undeveloped subdivision. If you've ever lived like in an area where they're building houses, it's packed with mud. So him going out there, he, had soil all over his shoes, ended up putting sandals on to go back to the grocery store that he had in his car. And what's interesting about this is a pair of his sneakers were actually tested, and the mud on them had traces of mica in the soil. And this was compared to the soil that was found around where Nancy was found, and that also was positive for finding mica in that soil. But the area around Nancy and Brad's neighborhood and home and subdivision did not have mica in it. And I find that so fascinating, something that you just never think about. I actually just watched a case where the killer was discovered because of pine needles on his shoes that were in only this one specific area where the body was found. I don't know why people think that they can get away with this type of stuff in this day and age. Just stop. One thing that the prosecution had to contend with, though, was there was some pretty big reasonable doubt. There was a call that was placed from the home phone to Brad that morning that he went to the grocery store when he said that he got a call from Nancy about the juice. It's at 6:40 a.m., which he said she placed, and it was 38 seconds long. His defense believes that this shows his innocence. I mean, how can one person be in two different places at once? But prosecutors believed that he used his telephone skills from his job working at Cisco, the telephone company, to set up an automated call to appear that it came from the house and that it was Nancy still alive. His boss did testify and did admit that this is something that they could do at their company. Now, an easy way to corroborate his statements and his path and everything that he took would be to take his cell phone and extract all of the data through the GPS. Unfortunately, though, by the time investigators got a warrant for his phone, it had been completely wiped of all of its data. And I mean, with the amount of Dateline, not only I watch, I can probably speak for all of you, the amount of true crime, Dateline, whatever you watch, I would be damn sure that if I had a clear path of where I was that proved my innocence, this is where this was it. You take my phone and you go through the GPS so that I could just be standing in the corner being I told you. Why would you ever wipe your phone? Why? Unfortunately, what happens a lot in these situations is the defense job is to find their client innocent, and in doing so, they try really hard to paint a really poor picture of the victim. And that was definitely done with Nancy. There was allegations that Nancy was having several affairs, and even suggested that one of the affairs was with a neighbor 9 months before Brad and Nancy's youngest daughter was born, insinuating that this was not even Brad's child, and even suggested that maybe this person was responsible for Nancy's death instead of Brad. The strongest piece of evidence in this case, though, did end up being ultimately what led to the arrest, and that was that Google Maps search of the area less than 24 hours before Nancy died, suggesting that not only was this a crime of passion, but also premeditation. The spot was already chosen. This trial ended up lasting 2 months. I guess this was the longest and most expensive trial in Wake County. And based on all of the testimony, especially from Carrie's friend, who was kind of like the person that Brad had pinned like being with Nancy, and hers being like, we never had plans. And then all of the control, the mental, emotional abuse, especially with money. The jurors came back with a unanimous verdict, guilty of murder in the first degree, and Brad Cooper was sentenced to life in prison. Like I said, though, there was a lot of controversy in this case, and Brad's lawyers felt like it was an unfair trial. There was just too much circumstantial evidence, and they appealed his conviction, and he was granted a new trial September 2013. The reason that it was granted was his defense lawyer said that there were 2 witnesses that they wanted to call but were not able to testify. And these witnesses were experts, they felt, that were able to show that a Google search could have been planted by investigators. Now, the reason they weren't allowed initially is because they were not trained computer experts. Like, this was not their designation. And the judge didn't think that anybody besides experts needed to be chiming in. So the defense said that, okay, even though they were not designated, they had been in the industry for over 20 years and felt like that should have been enough to qualify them to provide their testimony. So he was granted a new trial, but he decided instead of going back to trial, he would take a plea deal. He ended up pleading guilty to murdering Nancy, to second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 12 to 15 years in prison. A key part of this plea bargain, and pretty much like the only thing that was the most important to Nancy's family in making this decision, was that he also gave up his rights to ever being able to have custody of his children, and that they would remain being raised by Nancy's sister.
Much satisfied that we're now at a spot where there's closure to something that started all those years ago. And I'm thankful that this exit has occurred. It brings closure to us as a family, and we can move forward.
Do you feel like you have justice?
We have certainty and closure. I don't know whether justice is something I really thought about. We were more interested in making sure the kids' futures were secure, and we're satisfied with the outcome. And I think that's what counts for us.
They're doing good. They know what happened with Nancy, Bella especially, and it destroyed her for many years. And she's gotten over it. She's moved past. Thankfully, I've got an amazing family to help, and they got through it.
Does this mean now that their dad's out of their lives forever?
Yes.
How do you feel about that?
It's amazing. It's total relief. He doesn't deserve them. He doesn't deserve to know them.
Again, so heartbreaking, because it's like basically like just for the kids, her family, it's like, okay, like we can't risk this. We can't go through all of this again. Let's just accept this plea bargain. They did feel, though, like it was just not enough time. And they were right. Brad is already out of jail. He was released in 2020, and he was deported back here to Canada to go on with his life. So fuck me. What I will say is that there is something very inspiring and positive that came out of Nancy's death that I wanted to share. Nancy's family started something called the Butterfly Fund, and it's a charity that helps abused women Her sister also started a program. I don't believe that it has been publicly named because it works like in secrecy protectiveness for women who are in similar situations to Nancy. It's something that focuses a lot on getting the women that come through back into work, finding education, getting their freedom and their independence back. And I think that's so important because that's what Brad took away from Nancy. And one of her most important messages is just being able to recognize something like that, where it's not always obvious on the surface. An abusive relationship can happen even if you think that you are safe, like Nancy did, like her family did. And I think that's so important. I think that her constantly sharing Nancy's story and just being able to kind of relate that to hundreds of women that come through looking for help makes them feel like they're a little bit more understood and they're a little bit more seen, because there is like quite a bit of misconception about domestic violence being something that's very obvious. Like physical abuse, seeing somebody with bruises all over them all the time, calls to police. But I think what prevents a lot of women actually thinking that they're like, and acknowledging and believing that they're in a dangerous situation is not knowing that a lot of times it's not like that. You kind of explained it away as, oh, I'm not getting hit. That's not abuse, or that's abuse. Oh, sorry, obviously, but that's not the only form of abuse. There are so many different forms of abuse, and somebody who looks just like your typical suburban family who's going out to barbecues every week with your friends, but behind the scenes, like they're being taken off of credit cards and bank statements and given an allowance and only a certain amount of gas to get areas, and their paperwork to work is not being filed, like that is abuse. And Nancy's came very subtly. These steps were happening not overnight, not through weeks, not through months. Like this was happening through years. And it was, financial control, dependency on just him, humiliating, breaking her down, her confidence. She was a very strong-willed, bold woman, and most likely was one of those women who was thinking, I'm not going through anything physical, so she felt like she was somewhat still safe with Brad. So please be aware of all different types of abuse. Control and manipulation in any form is not okay. And no matter what, that road just never ends well. I know that is cliche, but it's like, if something's happened once, it's going to happen again, and it doesn't get better, it gets worse. And there's no situation where that is reversed and that you come out okay. It's either you make that decision to get yourself out of the situation, or that decision is made for you and it's not good. If you or someone you know is in a domestic violence situation, please just do it for yourself. You deserve it. Your family deserves it. Your kids deserve it. Just get out. If you need help, call 1-800-799-SAFE, which is the National Domestic Violence Hotline. Once again, that's 1-800-799-7233 or 799-SAFE. All right, you guys. That was heavy. That's it for me today. Thank you so much for listening. If you think that this can resonate with somebody, please share it with them. These stories are so, so important. There shouldn't be Nancy's out there at all. And yeah, I'm curious to see what you think. Like if you think that this was just not enough evidence, or if you believe it. I wholeheartedly believe that when that plea deal was taken, it wasn't because people just take plea deals, which is kind of what any supporter of Brad Cooper alludes to, is that you just take it because you want to get out of jail. I think that all of the signs were there, and they had been there for a really long time, just subtly growing. So anyways, thank you guys for watching. If you haven't already, please don't forget to like and subscribe. It means the world to me. The answer to this week's riddle is, what is full of holes but still holds water? And the answer is a sponge. And yeah, a sponge does, which is kind of really cool, because sometimes when you don't squeeze the sponge, the water just stays there. So how does it stay there? I'm sure it's a really easy scientific explanation, but I don't know that. Okay, I will see you in the next video. I will miss you terribly. Until then, make sure to love each other, love yourself, and I will see you soon. Bye.